Hello everyone, welcome to Asia and Pacific shows. In this episode today, we are going to talk about two different civilizations. One of the Western civilization, which is the most powerful civilization in the world, and second, the rising civilization, Sinic civilization from Asia. My guest is, our title is Sino-Western Relation and World Order. My guest is Dr. Zeno Leoni. Dr. Zeno Leoni is a lecturer in challenges to the international order at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London, based within the Joint Service and Staff College CSIS of the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom. He is also affiliated to the Lao China Institute of King's College London, where he is co-convener of the same institute's policy brief series, China in the World. His research focuses on US-China relations, American grand strategies, Sino-Western relations, and world order. In 2021, he published a monograph titled American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. Welcome, Zeno. Thank you for joining me today.
Lokman, thank you very much for your absolutely kind invite. It's an honor for me to be here with you and to have this discussion.
Thank you very much. In these shows, Zeno, we are going to talk about also your book. And let me ask first my question: where are we at between China and the West now? Why is the relationship so tense?
Thank you, Lokman. This is a broad question, but I think it's a very important one because many people, especially people outside of our sort of academic circle, pundit circles, they over the last few years they tend to ask me and to ask in general what's going on between the US and China, what's going on between the West and China. I think it's not an easy question to answer. It's not possible to answer this question if you only look at what has happened over the last few years. If you only look at, newspapers, articles talking about tensions between the US and China, the UK and China. I think we really need to take a broad view here and a long view, historical view. So in terms of broad view, we need to think in terms of the world order where we live in, which is quite a strange beast in my view, because it's Janus faced. It has two souls, two sides, two aspects. So on the one hand, the liberal international order is characterized by an international systems of states, and these states are sovereign. They have control of their own territory. They have national interest. They are ruled by political elites elected by citizens who are in those states. But on the other hand, you have a network of spatial, transnational flows, goods, finance, money, people, diseases, and so on, transnational threats. And so there is this constant tension between these two elements of the liberal international order, because flows like economic flows, they try to penetrate states, they try to travel across states. On the other hand, states with their elites, they try to control these flows in their own interest. They try to shape the international rules that actually in order to manage in a favorable way, if you want, those flows. So that's the context of Sino-Western relations. And that's really problematic because China is at the same time a sovereign state with its own interest, but on the other hand is also a major economic player, and we want to trade with China, right? So this is the tension. That was the broad perspective to answer your question. The long perspective is an historical one. And we really need to go back to halfway through the 19th century, to the Opium Wars between the England and between the UK and China, the open door policy of the United States. At the time, there was a world order that was globalizing under imperialist pressure, and the Chinese market, for the US, for the UK, for Japan, for other countries, it needed to be opened up. China was really a prize, right? It was, imperialist countries, so economic opportunities in China. But for cultural and institutional reasons, China didn't want to open to that kind of wave of globalization or imperialist pressure. And this is very important to understand, because this dynamic in the 19th century actually stays with us throughout the 20th century and is still with us in the 21st century. So fundamentally, the problems of the 19th century that haven't really changed. They're still there. There's a West that tries to, from an economic point of view especially, that wants China to become like us, like the West. But China doesn't want to do that. It wants to do things at its own pace, in its own ways. It has this selective globalism. Just before I conclude on this question, the only difference is that between the 19th century and nowadays, the main difference is that China has become the balance of power has changed, especially the military balance of power. And so this has affected the relationship between China and the West, because China now is much more powerful. And so it's more difficult for the West to impose on China, to get China to accept free market rule of law and liberalism and all the things that characterized our way of life. When does the balance of power start to change? I think in the early 80s, when Margaret Thatcher goes to Hong Kong, to Beijing to meet Deng Xiaoping to negotiate the extension of the British rule over Hong Kong after 1997, but China said no, we're not going to do that. So that's when you start to see how China has the power, the political power, and later on the military power to fire back at to react to foreign interference and Western influence. And then just to conclude, we saw this very much over the last 20 years when Chinese the defense budget went really high. Just bear in mind that while the US budget only doubled or less than doubled in about 20 years between the early 2000s and until nowadays, roughly. The Chinese military budget has grown about 15, 16 times. So that has a lot of implications, especially when China is positioned geographically over one of the most important regions of the world from a strategic point of view, the South China Sea, which together with the Suez Canal is really the heart of global trade. And that has an impact on the liberal international order, of course.
So, Zeno, what has the West got wrong with China? And how is it possible that we ended a Cold War in 1989, only 30 years later? Now we are talking for a new Cold War.
Thank you. So I think the West has done many things wrong with China, but that doesn't mean that China is perfect at the same time. And actually, I hope that China will not repeat some of the mistakes of the West in the future. But unfortunately, there's no answer here at the moment. But with regard to the West, I think we misunderstood China, or we wanted to misunderstand China intentionally. Because for many years we thought, or we hoped that, especially in the US, that China would have liberalized its economy first, and then that it would have become a democracy, a liberal democracy, like those where we live here, like in the UK, like in Italy, like in Australia. But actually, we misunderstood China because China has never said that, really. China said that they wanted to modernize, but not in a democratic, not in a political point of view. From a political point of view, they wanted to modernize in terms of, well, Deng Xiaoping for modernization, so agriculture, industry, technology, and defense. It didn't include democracy. So the signs were there, but we kind of didn't want to see that because we needed to trade with China, right? And also, I think it's very important to look at there's an historical junction, passage or moment in the post-Mao era, which is when the Chinese Communist Party decided to, issued a resolution, right, about Mao, which was in a way a sort of judgment on the Maoist experience. And that very important resolution says that, yes, Mao made many things wrong, like the Cultural Revolution was a disaster, the CCP said, and so this needed to be condemned. But the legacy of Mao wasn't really rejected. The legacy of Mao was the Chinese Communist Party, and that was actually Mao was praised for to have kept China together, to have left China with a powerful Communist Party. And the Communist Party here is really central in understanding the problems between China and the West, between China and the US, because the West and the US, and we will discuss that later, they would like China to liberalize, to privatize its economy, because that means that very competitive multinational corporation could go into China and actually do a lucrative business. But there's the CCP with this control over the strategic industries of China who doesn't allow that to happen. So perhaps we will go back to it. If I may add just a final point, there's another moment in the history between China and the West where we got things very wrong, and that's the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, with this idea of the end of history, the victory of liberalism over communism, we said that there were no more enemies to fight. And so there was a strategic pause. Strategic pause means that we could focus on geoeconomic interests, that we could focus on globalization after the Cold War, because there wasn't any great power competition anymore. And that was a great mistake for the West, because silently China was actually growing, was becoming a power, a great military power. And actually, the West facilitated that very much, especially in the 90s with the Clinton administration, who took China into the World Trade Organization. Clinton was very committed to bring China into the WTO because there was an interest for the US economy, but just a short-term interest to profit from investing in China, from opening up that market. But that actually, and so in the process of doing that, Clinton was telling the Congress, well, we need to, if they liberalize today, then they will democratize tomorrow. But as I said at the start of this answer to your second question, I think that was more what the West and the US wanted to see, wanted to hope, wished, rather than what actually China wanted to do. And there was no evidence for that. Obviously, in fairness, China could have been more honest in that regard, because it was clear on the Chinese side, you could tell that that's what the West was hoping to happen. So China could have been more transparent in this regard. However, I think this was this misunderstanding is having great consequences nowadays.
Now, the US and China relation has entered a negative spiral. Why is such thing happening? It is a civilization clash or great power competition. How we can evaluate this situation?
Thank you. So, and thank you for flagging the civilization aspect, because I think some colleagues, some pundits, they tend to blame, perhaps not just the civilization aspect, but this tension between a democracy and an authoritarian country. I think this is an oversimplification. So I don't think that this tension between the US and China is happening because China is an authoritarian country. I mean, values, they play their role, of course, and they especially in US foreign policy, there is also domestic dimension. There is Congress with senators and representatives. They need to be elected, and so there is that, of course. I don't want to deny that, but I think the reasons, the causes are deeper. And excuse me if I always go back to earlier history. I think is necessary. So since the rapprochement between the US and China, and actually we're celebrating the 50th anniversary in February, the US wanted China to develop, as I've tried to explain, because it was convenient for the US, because the US has this very competitive economy, especially after World War II. And so the US needed to globalize the world, to open up new markets. However, there is a contradiction here, because in order for China to become the locomotive of the world economy, China needed to become, a technologically advanced country. And in this dynamic, there is a contradiction, because in a way the US was responsible for helping China, helping a potential adversary to develop and to become powerful. And this is exactly what has happened. China, Germany, Japan, in the post World War II years, the US was committed to have these countries to develop. And it's funny that all of them became competitors of the US. Of course, Germany and Japan, they were always only, and they still are, economic competitors. China is also a military competitor, because it lies outside of the military network of the United States. It has a seat in the UN Security Council. It didn't lose World War II as Germany and Japan did. And so with China is a different story. And just to get to more contemporary years, and just to answer your question, the main issue is that China has become very competitive over sensitive technologies, next generation technologies, strategic technologies and industries. And it has managed to become competitive while avoiding, or if you want, cheating on these US-friendly, US-sponsored free market rules. China doesn't follow often the rules of the World Trade Organization. China has a good reason, in a way, to do that, but China is not following those. And so the US is very upset by this. And just to summarize, I think that a very important point here is to understand that China is resisting the Washington consensus. It doesn't want to liberalize. It doesn't want to break the link between the CCP and the strategic industries, which ultimately they also, they contribute to make China a powerful country, especially in foreign policy. This synergy between the state, between the party and some strategic industries means that China is actually a very powerful. It's a very powerful actor, and the US struggle to compete with that. So that's why the US is so upset, and that, as perhaps we will have the chance to explain later on, really has informed the foreign policy of Obama, Trump, and Biden over the last 12 years.
So, Zeno, from point of here, how has U.S. foreign policy towards China has evolved in the post 2008 area from Obama to Biden?
Okay, yes, that's also actually good for us to link to the previous question and to the final part of my answer earlier on. So they have something in common: Obama, Trump, and Biden. And this is the strategic objective in their relationship, in their foreign policy towards China. And it's not only that. They have also in common the fact that they had to manage a liberal international order, which is being eroded. by China and not only by China. So they have these two important objectives and these two problems they needed to address. And so strategically, there was a lot of continuity. So in my book, I talk about strategic continuity. But then there is also tactical change. Tactical change means that each of them has used a different recipe of foreign policy, a different approach to achieve the same objective. As we said, the same objective, which was coercing China into accepting some sort of liberalization, breaking that link between the Communist Party and Chinese industries, strategic industries. So how did they do that? So Obama, in my view, the signature policy in this regard was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was not just a regional trade agreement. It was a huge trade agreement. It was probably going to be the biggest free trade area in the world. That was the plan at the time, and it had stricter standards, environmental standards, labor standards, and some standards of some terms for transparency with regard to state-owned enterprises. And that meant officially, de facto, that China was excluded from some of the trade going on in that mega regional bloc. So in a way, although we didn't use the word decoupling at the time, there was a kind of decoupling. In hindsight, in the post-Trump era, now I can say that actually there was an attempt at decoupling, at splitting China, the Chinese economy, from some areas of the Asia-Pacific and Western economy, if we include Australia. And that was the Obama experience, a multilateral experience, globalist experience, more diplomatically. With Obama had a lot of aplomb, politically correct, and so on. With Trump, Trump tried to achieve the same objective, but with different tools. First of all, Trump wasn't a globalist, but we know that he was a nationalist. He had that confrontational character, a very power-driven approach to foreign policy. And so he got rid of the TPP, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also because he needed to win the elections, and so he promised that to his voters. But he tried to achieve the same objective with the trade war, with the tariffs wars with China. And he started to talk about decoupling. The tariffs were, as I said, a very confrontational tool, which sought to put pressure on the CCP. Essentially, it was saying, if you don't want to privatize, if you don't want to get rid of your strategic state asset, well, you're going to pay a price. That was the message there. And then later on, Trump sought to convince American industries, allies, to decouple from China. This is very difficult. Perhaps we can go back to the idea of decoupling later on in this conversation. But it's questionable to what extent has Trump achieved his goal. I don't think he has. I mean, certainly he created some worries in China, but he hasn't really achieved the goal, the established objective. Now we come to Biden. Biden, again, is trying to do the same thing that Obama and Trump were trying to do, but with a more sophisticated project, which is the B3W. Sorry, B3W. Yeah, so it's an awful acronym, but it means Build Back Better World. And perhaps we can expand on that later on in our conversation. But again, that's an attempt of Biden to save the US-led liberal order. And Biden, again, is an establishment man. He worked for Obama, with Obama. He's very different from Trump. He's an institutionally sensitive person. And so he's trying to put pressure on China, but with a a complex diplomatic and multilateral agenda. So that's a more sophisticated attempt, which perhaps where we see a conflating both the Obama and Trump approach, but perhaps we can expand on that later on.
Zeno, from here, I'm going to ask one question about the AUKUS agreement. What is your take on AUKUS? Recently there is some problem between the US and France. Is this a new anti-China military alliance? So what do you think about it?
I think it's meant to be a new anti-China military alliance. Although I would argue whether to what extent this is really new. So let me go back to when the news came out, because I think we have a bit of time. So I was in Oxford at an Indo-Pacific symposium. We were all there chatting with think tanks, colleagues, some people from government, and especially some of my colleagues who work more closely on Indo-Pacific dynamics than I do. They were very excited about this. And then there were other they thought it was sort of game changer, something really new. And then there were other colleagues who work more in the area of strategy, and they were more skeptic about how new and how consequential this will be. And they were arguing that AUKUS was mostly about showmanship. I think, to be honest, I stand more on this side, and I'll try to provide some evidence. I'll try to explain why this is the case. First of all, the UK and the US, they're already entangled to, culturally, institutionally, militarily to Australia. Somehow there were previous military treaties. And so I don't know whether we needed something new here, first of all. Secondly, if you look at the speeches of the leaders, especially Boris Johnson's speech, it was all about British jobs, British companies supporting the delivery of these nuclear-powered submarines. And so I thought for the US for the UK was an economic deal, also a way to show that the British government is delivering on the global Britain agenda. For the US was a way to show that the US is close to its allies in the region, because some countries have been doubting over the last few years. And then for Australia, of course, is also about equipping its defense for based on changing military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea. Of course, I don't want to deny that. But then there are also other reasons why I'm a bit skeptic about the alliance. These submarines will be delivered. The first one, in theory, will be delivered in 2034. So that's it's about 13 years down the line, and it doesn't sound that urgent. While if you look at the narrative, the rhetoric about China, those who are more concerned by China seem to think that it's a very urgent problem, and probably it is an urgent issue. But certainly the delivery of these submarines is not urgent at all. And yes, I mean, that's so all considered. I think that's we also need to think that there's already a pivot to Asia, or a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, to use Trump's phrase as opposed to Obama's phrase. I think AUKUS needs to be considered within that framework. So I don't really see it as something that will change the rules of the game or the balance of power.
I'm going to ask one question about the Taiwan. The recently relationship between Taiwan and Beijing as intense. Do you think a conflict is inevitable?
Yeah, I think is not inevitable. And sometimes when looking at what's going on with Taiwan, especially over the last few weeks, I'm a little puzzled, because I'm always thinking that until a few years ago, at least 10 years ago, there was a good momentum in Sino-Taiwanese relations. I mean, we always need to remember that these two countries have, I mean, there is a lot of exchanges in terms of foreign direct investments, businesses, people traveling, the culture. So I'm a little puzzled by what's going on. I think China, obviously, it's keen to retake Taiwan. I've argued recently in an article that it won't be, although China is being very assertive about Taiwan, I don't think the military option is actually something viable, because it will be very difficult to fight militarily with Taiwan for China. Obviously, China could destroy Taiwan, and that's a fact. This is probably true, but China will never be able to control Taiwan militarily. It will never be able to bring its troops on the Taiwanese island, and this is because of different reasons. Taiwan has a new military doctrine which was developed, I think, 10-15 years ago, and which is about guerrilla warfare at sea. As a very sophisticated early warning system, so Taiwan will know everything that the Chinese troops will be doing. But above all, Taiwan has a geography that doesn't allow an easy disembarkation of Chinese troops on the island. It's a very urbanized, densely urbanized island. It's a very easily mobilizable society. Taiwan has a disproportionate amount of reserves, of military reserves. So ordinary citizens who will be able to step in and support Taiwanese defense forces. But also, it's not just because of how difficult a conflict will be, and a conflict will really definitely put a high political cost on China. But it's also about how China sees. I know China has been very assertive in terms of rhetoric recently, especially Xi Jinping. But on the other hand, I don't see China starting a conflict or entering a conflict which will not be able to win easily. And this is really the strategic culture in China, the Sun Tzu kind of thinking about conflict. So I don't see that happening. But of course, one might say the conflict is not always rational, and so China might do something that actually goes against its interest. And of course, who knows? Finally, I'm a little concerned by Western warships traveling in the area. And also I'm concerned by this announcement, this statement by the Taiwanese government saying, China will invade us very soon. We need the West to support us. I think I suspect there's some domestic politics, there's some vested interest behind these Taiwanese announcements. And also, I don't know whether having British or French or US warships traveling through the straits, it really helps. At the end of the day, the United States has a Taiwan Relations Act, which very clearly says that the US will support Taiwan in case of conflict from a defensive perspective, but it will support Taiwan. So I don't think this is helpful to have these statements or to conduct this kind of operations. The Taiwan Relations Act is there. So we know that the US will step in somehow to support Taiwan. So I think everyone needs to calm down a little and try to resolve this in a diplomatic fashion.
Yes, that's great. Zeno, in the conversation in previous question, you're talking about the Biden's B3W. I'm asking about the question. Please explain to us about the Biden's B3W. What is it? What about?
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to say, first of all, that recently I was at a talk about the B3W, and there were very esteemed, prominent colleagues saying nobody knows what it is. And the same, I was in the same situation when talking to an editor of a very well-known website. I wanted to publish an article about it, and the editor told me, there's not enough information, so we cannot publish an article about it. It's true, there is not enough information. All we know
Yes.
comes from a fact sheet from the White House and from a G7 communique, both published in June 2021, this year at the G7 in Wales, and the fact sheet was published ahead of the G7. So I'm trying to guess what it might look like based on my understanding of American grand strategy. So for me, again, it's about the Biden administration trying to stop the erosion of a US-sponsored, US-led liberal order and trying to contain China. So it's a sort of decoupling, and I will explain decoupling in this context. It's about protecting the next generation technologies in the areas of digital infrastructure, health, global health, and the greening of the economy. If you think about it, this is the future of, a good part of the future of the near future of the world economy. This is where a lot of money will be invested. And so in a way, the B3W is an opportunity for the US to set the standards in those industries, in those economic areas, and exclude China, again, in a way like the Trans-Pacific Partnership was trying to do. And in fact, what we know from the Biden administration is that we know this for sure, is that there will need to be stricter standards on these next generation technologies. And so, in my view, this is really an operation of positive decoupling. I haven't coined the phrase positive decoupling, but I'm borrowing it to explain what the B3W is. And positive decoupling means that we don't decouple from China completely. We cannot kick China out of our national economies, but we can make sure that for the future technologies, next generation, contemporary next generation technologies, perhaps more sensitive technologies, we will set the standards so we keep China at bay, we keep China away from it. And in that sense, is the B3W competes with the Belt and Road Initiative. However, the B3W is a very challenging project, ambitious project, because while the Belt and Road Initiative is about China only, there's a centralized government there. There's a government which has a strong relationship with its industries. The B3W is, first of all, a coalition of countries. The EU, UK, Italy, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, perhaps. And so it's difficult to have everyone to agree on the agenda. And in fact, we know that not everyone agrees on what should be the response against China. And there are some divisions within the G7, within the B3W. We saw that back in June. And so this will be a challenge for the Biden administration, for sure, to convince everyone. And please, if I may just go back to something which was about AUKUS, but it's related to the problems of the B3W, and then I'll conclude. So AUKUS was a symptom of a crisis within the Atlantic bloc. We saw the crisis between France and the US, the UK, and Australia. This is a problem for the B3W because the crisis over AUKUS tells us that the West is fragmenting from a geopolitical point of view. And this hides also this big debate about whether Europe should be in an Atlantic defense system led by the US, or whether Europe should have its own military union, its own defense. and this is even more interesting these days now that the UK is out. So there is a lot going on there. We cannot unpack that now, and also it's still very speculative. We will find out over the next few years. But certainly this is not good news for the B3W, which is trying to create a coalition of countries, not only against China, but also against China. But that's challenging to have everyone agreeing on this.
As a summary of this conversation, Zeno, I would like to ask, in your observation and according to your experience, do you see the Western civilization in a decline process compared to China or in face of China?
That's an amazing
comment,
question.
As a comment and as a question, just for conversation.
Absolutely. I think it depends. Yeah, I mean, so you see now there is this idea of post-Western world.
Yes.
And I think it depends what, sociologists, economists, everyone gives it a different definitions. I think it depends on, to me, post-Western world means that there is a geopolitical crisis, as I kind of alluded to a few seconds ago. And, at the end of the Cold War, we thought, okay, we are the same thing. We are one thing. The US, Europe, we are just one bloc. There is not that view anymore. This is being eroded. This is a great advantage for China, because the only way to deal with China from a position of strength is to have demographic and economic mass, and only a united EU, a united Western coalition could achieve that. And that's one thing. Trying to address more specifically your question, I think we are a declining civilization. And this takes me outside of my international relations expertise, but we are declining economically. We are declining in terms of values. Our values are being eroded. We are declining in the sense that there is a huge gap between governments and citizens, inequality, but also lack of trust in our political elites. And also I feel like we are declining in terms of sacrifice. We are not ready to. I don't think we are a civilization that will sacrifice anymore in order to fight a war. And hopefully there won't be. But I don't think we are a generation that is ready to sacrifice in terms of working hard, in terms of facing any kind of hardships. So yeah, and I'm sorry I can't be very specific about that, but I have that feeling that we are declining. We are a weaker society.
Yes, because currently, when you compare to according to the power transition theorist, the China, if we take it, the China as a new challenger and rising power to the establishment power, we saw the China currently are unhappy with the new international order and try to do something with its own, by its own. And when we look at, and I think we see the Beijing has many advantages when you compare to compared to the Western. For example, the recent AUKUS agreement, we see there is a crisis between the France and UK, and France and US. And other side, when you mention it to the B3W, you see maybe there is no strong consensus between the member countries, but the Belt and Road Initiative sponsored by one power, one center, and etc. Many examples. I think the China, I don't know how we can conclude, but the advantage of China, I think, is more than the Western side.
Absolutely, at this time, yes. And also the fact that just look at China nowadays. They can afford, at the time being at least, to continue with their COVID-0 policy, because they have a big economy. They can afford that. We cannot. Nobody in the West could afford that. On the other hand, perhaps also to play devil's advocate, and so that's why China doesn't need formal alliances. But if China will ever want to have an extra-regional global grand strategy, I think it certainly will need more formal alliances. It will need to have, if it wants to become a truly great power like the US has been, well, it will need military agreements, military bases here and there across the world. And you know, when you enter into those kind of relationships, they're obviously great because, you know, they work very well for the US, but they can be inexpensive, they can give you troubles. So at the time being, yes, I think China has an advantage, but it will have to come out more and more and engage more and more with the world and take more risks for sure. And I think this is a good example of a more general point of the fact that China really has this approach to the globalization and the liberal order, which is very selective. It only tries to take what is convenient for China. But I don't know if China will be able to continue on this selective globalism path forever. So it will be very interesting to see how they manage this tension.
Yes. Lastly, Zeno, I would like to take a few words about your books. Apologize, I couldn't bring on the screen, but I'm going to read the name of your books, and then I'm going to take a few comments about your books. American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush, and China's Hegemonic Challenge. What can you say a few words about comments about your books, please? For
Right.
the student,
So
especially for student of international relations and
oh, all right. Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. Yeah, so first of all, with regard to the case study, the US and China and changing world order, we've talked about it throughout this conversation. Perhaps I invite students of international relations, if they are bored with realism, with liberalism, if they want to provide a more interesting angle to great power relations, please do read chapter 1. Actually, sorry, it's chapter 1 is the introduction. Do read chapter 2. It's about a Marxist theory of imperialism. In particular, it's about Lenin theories of interstate rivalry. And I think you will really enjoy that. I think it will be a fresh view on to try to explain what's going on between the US and China. If I can briefly anticipate what Lenin says, and this is also my way of looking at US-China relations. First of all, each state tries to sponsor, to promote their strategic industries when they go to summit, to international agreement, trade agreement in the international arena, on the one hand. On the other hand, and they also promote the interest of their industries, even waging war, occupying territory, coercive diplomacy, and so on. On the other hand, Lenin said tensions, the rise and fall of great powers creates tensions between the hegemon and the rising challenger, and this is happening because of globalization, because capital, money are invested in countries where labor it's cheaper, where the margin for profits are higher, and that in the long term triggers the rise of countries, as it's happening with China. And so, just to summarize, these two components, the relationship between governments and industries on the one hand, and the rise and fall of economic rise and fall of great powers, it's what triggers tension, competitions between states. And really, the way I see this is the technological competition between the US and China, and I think the Silicon Valley in the US is really a good example of this dynamic. We see the US the US and China trying to compete over 5G, over semiconductors, over who controls the internet, and so on. So please do read the chapter, do read Lenin's theory of imperialism. You'll find it refreshing.
Thank you very much, Zeno, for your comments. And audiences, they can find the book now available on Amazon, on Kindle, hardcover, and other sellers. I would like to repeat the name again: American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism after Bush, and China's Hegemonic Challenge. Thank you very much, Zeno. Thank you for joining me again.
Lokman, thank you. I mean, that was lovely and, very kind of you to invite me here, and thanks for also the book presentation as well. I mean, that was great.
Thank you very much, and thank you for our audiences. They have been us until now. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and support us.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.